Okay.
Starting, and you're on.
Well, welcome to the, essentially this is like a review or questions and answer session for the final exam. And of course, this is Mary Grace Richardson, one of the assistants for the course that you've probably been seeing. She's been commenting a lot on the postings. And so we thought what we could do, since we don't have anyone on there right now, is just maybe go over some of the approaches that we've been talking about in sessions 3, 4, 5, and just making sure that you all know how to apply the three worldviews to the institutions and to anticipating trends and developments in the global economy and the basic things that this course is all about, so you're ready for the final exam. And so did you have any comments about our overall plan for discussion today then?
Yeah, and the only thing I want to add too is we'll also be reviewing the structure of the final, what you can expect for it, tips for studying for it, and then just rules to follow to make sure that you're able to access it well and that you won't be shut out of it or anything like that. Yeah.
All right, okay. Mary, you thought it might make sense based on what you've been seeing from the postings and that it probably would make sense for us to start maybe with session 3.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So just for week 3, I saw there wasn't as much participation on the discussion board, and so regarding like the South Korea case, I wanted to make sure that we all had a clear understanding of what were some of the factors that led to South Korea, like Asian financial crisis, and we felt really solid about that before we go into even just studying for the final.
So, for example, in week 3 we had the these are the questions that I posted at the very beginning, of the course, that causes the crisis. What was the cause of the financial crisis South Korea experienced in 1997? Was it external or internal? Was South Korea to blame? And so, well, I mean, that's something fundamental that we covered in the videos, lecture videos, right? But so what do you think now? Yeah, I mean, to me, I think that the answer is pretty straightforward, right? I mean, I think, of course, there were internal and external factors. And to me, in my mind, what I thought that students would do would have in mind the framework, right? That the indicators, we had that one slide where I presented all of the indicators that could, predict whether a country's going to have a massive financial crisis or so on. I think most of the boxes or most of the indicators were red for South Korea in 1997, leading up to this crisis. They had there were external factors and internal factors. And the external factors, the current account deficit was very large. They were having difficulty competing with in their exports. They export a lot of electronics products, and so Japan had been manipulating its currency, the yen, and so the currency in Japan was undervalued intentionally. So the Japanese government was purposely keeping the currency weak to boost their own exports. So that made it difficult for Korea to export its products, and because they compete in electronics. So there's one reason, large current account deficit. And I think, though, the underlying issue was also the contagion effect, right? And so I hope students would know about that, right?
Yeah, and that's just gonna be like a domino effect, once like one area in the region is affected, it's just gonna be kind of like a whirlwind from there. But one thing is, even that follow-up question, was South Korea to blame? I mean, considering that there were the internal factors and the external ones, do you think that South Korea could have prevented its own economic crisis, or do you think it was just bound to happen and maybe it was exacerbated by the structure of their economy and the decisions that they made?
I think South Korea in some ways wasn't in as a precarious position as maybe some other countries, but it was there was a financial weakness internally within South Korea because of their economic development model. And I think something that had contributed to the rapid industrialization of South Korea was that the government, in fact, encouraged this easy lending, easy financing to the chaebol, the big family-owned conglomerates. And we know some of these famous companies like Samsung and Hyundai and LG. And for a time, the government actually owned the banks and encouraged this easy lending. The banks were privatized, discontinued. And I think this, in the case, they call it connected lending, right? So I hope people understand, the students understand that maybe this contributed to the rapid industrialization of the chaebol, these big family-owned conglomerates, and allowed them to invest and expand in a lot of different areas. But the lending from the South Korean banks wasn't really done on the basis of Western accounting practices. Can this company repay the loan? It was more on the basis of, oh, we know these people. They're connected to us either through family connections or personal connections. And so we're going to make the loan regardless of whether they can pay it back or whether it's a financially viable undertaking. So this did lead to the rapid industrialization of these Korean-owned conglomerates, the chaebol. But at the same time, obviously, they couldn't always pay back the loans.
Yeah.
And so when the financial crisis hit and investors already were getting nervous, and the foreign banks, which had made all the loans to the Korean banks so the Korean banks could make the loans to the chaebol, the foreign banks saw what was happening. They saw that country after country was having a financial crisis in the Southeast Asian region. So a lot of the foreign banks said to the Korean banks, we want all our loans back right now. Pay us back right now. And of course, the Korean banks said, we can't do it because all the money is in. We've loaned out all the money to the chaebol, and they aren't in a position to repay. So it was evident then there was this internal financial weakness in the financial system of South Korea. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, there was a contagion effect anyway. It might have affected South Korea anyway, but especially I think when people really saw the financial weakness, they got spooked.
Well, and so then to like follow up with that too, so like the IMF comes in, they give them a loan, and we do, of course, like we can apply those concepts like the three views and how they saw, the IMF's loan like effect on South Korea. But and I believe this is in the reading too, but like, were the South Koreans like that receptive to the IMF's like restructuring of their economy, or was it something where they had to do it because that's what the IMF wanted?
So, I mean, that's one of the key points in this course too, right? It's that when the IMF provides financial assistance to a country, and I'm holding up the quotation marks here because, the IMF provides, financial assistance to the country, but it always imposes these conditions. Because it says, the IMF has a diagnosis of the problem. How did we're going to provide assistance to a country that is in a financial crisis like this, because we don't want that country's economy to collapse. We don't want the currency to collapse. We're trying to maintain stable exchange rates. We're trying to maintain stability in the global economy. That's the IMF's mission. So they will provide financial assistance, but the IMF has a diagnosis of the problem. They say, well, how did you get in this mess in the first place? We'll give you the financial assistance, but if you don't fix some problems that got you in this problem in the first place, then we'll just be giving money down a black hole. Mm-hmm. We'll have to come back here and help you again and again. So we want you to make some policy changes that we as embedded liberals at the IMF, right? They are liberals. They believe in free markets, minimal government intervention in the economy. Our diagnosis is that you need to make some policy changes, right? And those are in a more liberal direction. And so the problem, of course, is that governments really don't like to do this because the policy changes are always the same. Isn't that true? It's like a cookie cutter.
Yeah. And that was the biggest thing too that I believe from the reading was that the idea, it's not that their economy, like their structure wasn't right, it's just that it wasn't conducive to those external factors. So they didn't have to redo everything and make it that cookie cutter economy, but
some economists said that, but the IMF didn't agree with it. Yeah. The IMF said, listen, and this is something useful for international managers to know about the IMF. that this is the criticism, and we read a critic of the IMF, Joseph Stiglitz, a Nobel Prize-winning economist, and this is his famous critique of the IMF that we read in that article, What I Saw at the Economic Crisis. He says, look, the IMF almost always imposes the same conditions, like a cookie cutter, almost exactly the same plan in every case. And he's critical of that. He said it should be customized to the problems, unique problems of the country. That may be true, but the fact is the IMF does do it this way. It always imposes similar conditions. And there's a useful benefit to that for international managers. If you know what the IMF is going to do when it provides assistance to a country, if you know the conditions it will impose on that country, you can predict what the policies are going to be and what impact those policies will have on the country's business environment. And then you can develop a more effective strategy for your company. And so we know what the conditions are, right?
Yeah. They didn't
know what the impact
totally...
is. Every time, it's true for this. This reason I signed this case on IMF in South Korea is it's so classic, so typical. The conditions are so similar in this case as they are in Greece or Argentina or Brazil. I don't care what country, the IMF always has the same pattern. And so if you know that as a manager before it happens, you can call the home office, the headquarters, and say, hey, here's what we can expect in the country that I'm doing business in for the next, sales are going to be slow. I'm sorry. We're probably going to go in a recession.
Yeah.
Because what are the conditions and what impact do they have, right? We talked about it, I guess, we'll have people know. Do they know what the conditions are? They should know this. This is standard. This is important.
Right. And I think that's something that we just wanted to review as well today.
Oh, this is the crucial. So if you're talking about applying the 3 views to, let's say, the IMF, the 2 things you should be talking about, and the 3 views have different perspectives on these 2 things about the IMF, and the 3 views have very different perspectives on the IMF conditions and the system of weighted voting that the IMF uses to make decisions. So if we talk now about the 3 views on the IMF conditions, we get very different perspectives on those IMF conditions. And so I think if anyone were talking about, let's say, applying the 3 views to the IMF, you could use the South Korea case as an example and say, what would the liberals think of the conditions the IMF posed? What would the structuralists think? What would the economic nationalists think? And so we know the embedded liberals who believe there is a need for a strong institution built into the global economy. Those are the people that work at the IMF.
Yeah.
And so they would say the IMF conditions, there's a logic behind them, they make sense. And a good answer, if I were applying the 3 views to the IMF, I would talk about what are some specific IMF conditions and what do the embedded liberals think of those and what do the economic nationalists think of those conditions and what are the structuralists. Now, the embedded liberals of the IMF would say, here are the conditions. Reduce the budget deficit. They always say that. And so there's a logic, right? The IMF has a reason.
It's more of this idea of austerity, right? That it's so if you don't have the money, don't spend the money. So you have to make a lot of different cuts.
If you don't have the money, you're coming to us asking for money. So what happened? Why don't you have any money? Well, I guess you spent it. No wonder, because you have a huge budget deficit. And the IMF knows that in many countries, especially in emerging markets, what happens often is governments spend more money than they take in tax revenues. They have a budget deficit. And they will finance that budget deficit by borrowing. And they do that by selling government bonds to foreign investors. The United States does this too. We do this too. We have a big budget deficit. We finance it by selling government bonds to foreign investors, mainly in China, that finance our budget deficit so we can keep spending beyond our means, right? And so many countries do this, but if a developing country does that, it can do it only up to a point. And then eventually the people that are buying those government bonds start to get nervous and skeptical and say, maybe we won't keep buying these government bonds to finance your spending. And that's when a country is in a crunch and might have to go to the IMF.
Well, and then also let's say with those budget cuts as well, and this might be going down a different path because I just know, for instance, with Greece, when they see that there are a lot of cuts in the budget, then there are a lot of jobs that are cut. So then that's not stimulating for the economy. And
no, but the IMF says, well, we're sorry, but the root cause of the problem in many cases are these budget deficits. So our diagnosis of the problem is too much government spending and intervention and programs. Cut the budget. And then you won't have to borrow so much money to finance it. And then you won't end up coming to us in a crisis. So cut the budget deficit. But the impact on the business environment of the country is drastic spending cut can lead to a just massive slowdown in the economy. Mm-hmm. And the IMF's answer is, it's not our problem. Don't blame the doctor for the bitter medicine you must take to solve your illness.
Yeah.
So that's their answer.
Well, but the extreme liberal would just say, why does the IMF even exist?
The IMF, don't just let the country gets in a crisis, let it pay the consequences, let its economy collapse. That'll teach them a lesson. Other countries will notice that nobody came to help that country, and they'll be more careful and cautious in their spending in the future. Mm-hmm. But if the IMF comes and bails out a country, then countries they'll say, oh, we can be reckless and crazy, the IMF will come and bail us out. So the extreme liberals think that the IMF creates a moral hazard, encourages this reckless, irresponsible behavior. Do you think that's true? I don't think it's true. I think there's some evidence to show that countries don't easily say we can be crazy and reckless because no problem, we'll just take money from the IMF.
Yeah. Well, I think in both the case with Greece and South Korea, they don't like what's imposed on them by the IMF.
It's so painful.
Yeah, so I don't think they're thinking like, oh, it's free money. Like they realize that they would have to like completely restructure their economy, and it's not the way that they've done things before, and they have to pay like these like interest rates and everything. So I don't think it's ideal for the people receiving.
It's terrible. I mean, there's a reason countries only go to the IMF as a lender of last resort, because governments know the pain that will come if they get a financial assistance from the IMF. It's going to result in the IMF saying, okay, here's your money, but you're going to get it. The condition for you to get it is drastic spending cuts. And the politicians will say, wait, but we need that social program, or we need this spending, or we need to have this payment. And the IMF will say, no, it's not our problem. So I think that's where countries hate going to the IMF. That's where I think the extreme liberals are wrong.
Yeah.
Countries aren't going to be reckless and partying and doing things and just expect the IMF to bail them out, because when the IMF bails them out, it's painful.
Yeah, I don't think there's, in these cases, I don't think there's the moral hazard there that they think there would be. I do wonder if it's a different situation though for, let's say, with like the bailouts, like the auto and, like with the financial crisis in the United States, if that type of like, if extreme liberals would have a more valid point for that. But what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, of course there's a valid point. I mean, if the government bails out the banks when they have done irresponsible lending, right, and mortgage-backed securities and crazy things, and it resulted eventually in a terrible collapse of the U.S. And so then they're saying, well, the U.S. government will bail out the banking system in the United States. Aren't you then encouraging banks to be reckless and irresponsible because they figure the U.S. government will bail them out? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there is that moral hazard that you are creating. But at the same time, if you don't bail out the banks and they collapse, the whole U.S. economy collapses, and then the whole global economy collapses, it's really a bad situation. I think you have to bail them out. Yeah.
Even it's like reluctantly. Mm-hmm. But I wonder too that it's like, it would be more of like a similar case if the government said, hey, we're going to give you this loan, we're going to bail you out, but then we want to restructure the system as well. But it doesn't seem like that happened the way.
Maybe not as much in the U.S. as, I mean, there was, they were saying, well, maybe now we'll give the banks money, but bail them out, but in return they can't give giant bonuses to their corporate executives, and they pushed back on that and said, we have to do that. So, but yeah, in the IMF case, the countries that get financial assistance from the IMF are bailed out by the IMF. They have this painful conditions that are imposed: drastic cuts in spending, increased interest rates, removing restrictions on foreign investment. And the IMF is saying, we're doing these things because it will stabilize your economy, stabilize your currency. For example, if we increase interest rates, force your central bank to increase interest rates, It'll bring back a capital account surplus that'll balance out the current account deficit and will stabilize the value of your currency and keep your economy stabilized. So this is why we are doing this. But of course, the impact when a country drastically increases interest rates is the slowdown in the economy is very severe and could put the economy into a deep recession, as happened in South Korea, as happened in Greece. And so people say, this is hurting the country. And the IMF will say, what do they always say?
It's what you need.
Yeah, don't blame the doctor for the bitter medicine you must take now. Mm-hmm. So that's why the IMF isn't that popular.
Yeah. Well, in this case, too, maybe just to hit it home a little bit more, it's like the economic nationalists, their issue that they would have with the IMF is more about the weighted voting in it, that it's going to.
Well, no, I think they would have issue with conditions.
The conditions too.
So they would point to the conditions. So they would say, what are these IMF conditions? Removing restrictions on foreign direct investment to allow foreign companies to come in. The embedded liberals at the IMF would say, what's wrong with that? Allow foreign investors to come in and buy assets in South Korea, even if they are a very low price because of the crisis. It'll bring in foreign investment, which will stabilize your economy and keep the value of the currency stable. But economic nationalists would say, by removing restrictions on foreign direct investment, you're allowing foreign companies to come in and acquire prized assets in South Korea at bargain basement prices because of the crisis. And so it looks to us like maybe the IMF is just serving the national interests of the group of 5 most powerful nations that have a lot of influence in the IMF, as we'll see when we talk about weighted voting. And so the economic nationalists would have that explanation. That's the real reason the IMF did it. It's to help the most powerful nations in the IMF. And the structuralists would say the real reason the IMF is imposing these conditions is there are corporations that control the governments of the most powerful, rich nations in the IMF. And the IMF is just carrying out the orders of the big corporate interests. Mm-hmm. And so those conditions, removing restrictions on foreign investment, allows corporations to come in. The structuralists would say the IMF is just serving the interest of big corporate interests. It doesn't care about South Korea. And the people at the IMF would say, no, we're trying to stabilize the economy, and this is the way to do it. So there's at least 3 different ways of looking at this, right?
Yeah. Well, I guess in this case, we have our question on the discussion board about what was the final outcome for South Korea? How are they doing today? Were the embedded liberals right about the policies that they put into place? And is how they're doing today just like an example of, them being kind of like the knight in shining armor with all the best economic ideas?
Well, I mean, you could say, well, how is South Korea doing today? How many years now? It was 1997, the crisis happened. How many years is that? Wow, that's a long time. That's over 20 years, right? 20 years. Mm-hmm. So if we look at how is South Korea doing today, it's flourishing, thriving, prospering. I know there's North Korea, but that's another separate issue. But South Korea is doing great. And so you could say, well, maybe the IMF, when it put in these conditions and forced South Korea to restructure its economy, maybe that was beneficial.
Do you think that's coincidence, though? Do they just happen to work out? That
I don't think it's coincidence. I think the IMF said, hey, put an end to that connected lending. Now, if Korean banks lend money to the chaebol, they have to do it on the basis of Western accounting practices that's making sure they can repay the loan. So they strengthened the South Korea's financial system. They did remove some restrictions on foreign direct investment. They did liberalize the labor laws, right, to make it easier to fire workers, no more lifetime employment. And all these things the IMF said are beneficial, will bring in more foreign investment. But again, the structuralists are saying, well, yeah, it serves the corporate interests of big companies, that foreign companies that could come in. And so be that as it may, I mean, the South Korean economy is highly competitive, thriving, growing. The IMF thinks this is our success story.
Exactly. Yeah. This is just proving, that when you apply these methods, this will be your outcome. So do you think in that way more countries see the IMF as more favorably because they see these success stories?
You would think, but even in South Korea, when I go there and talk to senior executives at LG Electronics, every year we were going there for so many years, they would stand up and denounce the IMF and say the IMF, they had an economic nationalist view. They would say the IMF just did this to help the United States and help the United States get more leverage over South Korea and help US companies invest in South Korea. So they don't see it that way. And, you know, so I don't know, it's just different ways of looking.
Yeah, that's why we have all the worldviews.
And it depends on your starting assumptions. But most economists and most IMF people obviously would say they did the right thing and they stabilized South Korea. But even some respected economists, liberal economists, would say maybe it didn't have to be quite as severe.
Yeah, if there's any way to like balance.
Could it have been a little more moderate?
Yeah, exactly.
Did it have to be so cookie cutter, right? But those economists, same economists, would say we agree with the IMF and what it does, but maybe just soften some of these conditions a little bit.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, and just even so that was our topic during like week 3 with South Korea. And then just to shift over a little bit to week 4. So this week we were learning more about like the World Bank Group and specifically for our discussion topic 1 about the IFC, the International Finance Corporation. And based on the Chad and Cameroon case, I think we wanted to see students apply the 3 worldviews again, but to also see, you know, is like the IFC, their decisions, you know, to give out loans to certain corporations. Are those appropriate? Are those loans going to the right companies? And just generally, what are people's views on the IFC?
So, I mean, I think, and it's appropriate to go after talking about the IMF to move to the World Bank Group because, by the way, just as the IMF has an executive board of directors, 24 members, and so does the World Bank Group have an executive board of directors, and but separate, different people, obviously. And just as the IMF has the system of weighted voting on that executive board where they make decisions, same thing with the World Bank Group. They have an executive board with 24 members and a system of weighted voting. And I think it is interesting to notice that in both cases on the executive board of the IMF and of the World Bank Group, the group of 5 countries have, they don't have a majority of the votes, but they have enough votes in both cases to have veto power over major decisions. So simple decisions like should we give financial assistance or a loan to country X, all you need is a simple majority. It's 50% of the votes on the executive board plus 1. But for important decisions, who's going to be the next managing director of the IMF, or should we have a major change in the rules of the IMF, you need 70% of the votes on the executive board. And since the group of 5 most powerful nations in the IMF have more than 30% of the votes, and that group of 5 is United States, United Kingdom, Germany, France, and Japan, those 5 countries can veto some decision, even if every other executive board member wants it. They can veto those important decisions. And since the United States has more than 15% of the votes, really important decision, like let's change the rules on voting, require 85% of the votes on the executive board. And since the United States always has about 16% of the votes on the executive board of both the IMF and the World Bank Group, it can veto major decisions, you see. So those 5 countries, and especially the United States, have a lot of influence. And so that's why the structuralists point to the IMF and the World Bank, the weighted voting system, and say it is rigged in favor of the most powerful nations, the economic nationalists say, or the structuralists say, the richest nations. And so when it comes to something like creating a new part of the World Bank Group called the International Finance Corporation, which was created in the late 1950s, the structuralists would say, this is a part of the World Bank Group, this International Finance Corporation that is making loans directly to corporations. What? And the structuralists would say, this is ridiculous. This is helping rich corporations get even richer and help them invest in developing countries. But the embedded liberals of the World Bank Group would say, no, we did this because it's a way to encourage investment in developing countries by giving loans to even big multinationals like ExxonMobil if they're willing to invest in a country like Chad. to facilitate that and encourage them to do that. So 3 different views about something like the IFC.
Yeah, and then even, you know, the discussion in the last class, or the last time this class ran, you know, there was a lot of discussion online about how, you know, I think the students agreed with the idea of the IFC giving loans out to corporations, but more so to giving out loans to corporations that were not as big or just like needed help to be able to like do the business. In the ExxonMobil case with like Chad,
here we have a case of IFC giving loans to ExxonMobil.
Yeah, and they're seeing it as like that money could be used in another place because ExxonMobil doesn't need the loan. They didn't necessarily need the money. What they did need was for, you know, the World Bank approval so that it would reduce their political risk, so it would be easier for them to enter the country,
right?
So that they'd be kind of more, I guess the people there would be like more receptive to it. So that might be an example to people who are taking this class and want to be managers, is that this is another way, getting a loan like this is another way to get into a new country, to have a stamp of approval.
To me, that's the ultimate lesson of this Chad Cameron case, because it's difficult to get a loan from the IFC. You have to go through a lot of red tape. It's a hassle. It sometimes takes like a year to get approved. Oh my gosh. And so you might wonder, so this case is interesting because here we see ExxonMobil and a consortium, a group of oil companies joining together to get a loan from the IFC. They don't need the money. ExxonMobil doesn't need the money to do this project. But IFC gave them the money. In part, the IFC was encouraging them, please invest in this poor country, Chad. And ExxonMobil said, okay, in that case, we'll go to Chad. But ExxonMobil didn't need the money. So why did they take the money and have to go through all this hassle and file environmental impact reports? The reason is because, just as Mary was saying, that if a company like ExxonMobil gets a loan from the IFC, then what it is saying is, since the IFC is part of the World Bank Group, what that is saying to the whole world is what ExxonMobil is doing in Chad, building oil wells in Chad and a giant pipeline to transport the oil to the coast and to export it all over the world, that must have some developmental impact. It must be some positive benefit to the countries of Chad and Cameroon for doing this. Otherwise, the World Bank Group wouldn't have supported it. And so that gives great public relations to ExxonMobil when it invests, and it can say, you see, what we're doing here isn't just for us to make money, of Chad and Cameroon. And I think that's a good lesson for international managers. Why get financing from the IFC even if you don't need it? Good PR. And it reduces political risk, because governments might think twice to do something bad to you, because then if they don't only do something bad to you, if you have an IFC loan, they've done something bad to the World Bank Group. And most governments would think twice.
Yeah, so you're
that's
talking about
why
more of the world now.
That's a reason to do it. And for smaller companies, what I'm noticing, we're doing research on this, another professor and I, and we have discovered that smaller companies like the IFC loan, because it gives them a stamp of approval to potential co-investors, other banks, that might say, what is this little company? Oh, you got an IFC loan? Wow, you must be, we let them do a credit check on you. You must be pretty good company.
Okay.
So there's a real benefit to getting an IFC loan.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I wonder, I haven't read as much about the IFC giving out loans to smaller.
Yes, we're doing research on that. We're doing our own original survey. We've surveyed smaller companies that have taken IFC loans. Why did you take it? Oh, not because we needed the money, but because it gave us a stamp of approval. And then other investors would understand that we were a serious company and take us seriously. And
oh, wow. Is there any other literature out there like that? Or
we are the original. This is, you're hearing it here for the first time.
Yeah.
The results will be published soon.
Oh, shoot, because I totally wanted to post something like that on the discussion board, but...
You can post it, but the published article will make us, or the hope is it's going to make us famous. And
yeah, that's important.
then make Thunderbird famous.
Yeah, exactly.
More famous.
Yeah. Well, one thing, I'm just looking at the time right now.
Okay, we probably need to wrap it up.
Yeah, but we definitely want to just like touch base and talk about like the final, because we don't want there to be any confusion. So when you guys are taking it, that there's like no worries going into it. You're really just like focused on the material, not the format, and we want to clear up any questions there might be about that. So as you guys might have seen for the course, the final is going to be open from Monday, October 2nd until Friday, October 6th. And for that, it is not open book, it's not open notes, it's like a closed browser. You can't be searching online. Before you take it as well, I believe they have to show, right, they use their computer camera to be able to show that their desk space is clear, there's nothing else around them, they're in the room by themselves. And so those are just some of the things just to start the exam. Is there any other, am I missing any of the kind of requirements?
No, I think that's it, but I think, you don't want to wait until the exam date to, what I would do is review all of the discussion questions that were posted for weeks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and just get a sense of what kinds of questions are important. But I would prepare in advance. I would be ready, thinking already, how would I apply the 3 views to the IMF or the World Bank Group or the WTO? What examples would I use? What examples from the assigned readings would I use? Mm-hmm. For example, in the IMF's case, you could refer to the IMF and South Korea case, as we just discussed. For WTO, you could make reference to the cases on trade disputes. And for the World Bank Group, you could make reference to the Chad Cameroon case,
Yeah, and just make sure it's all multiple choice, right? Is that correct? That's the same format as last time. Okay, great. So
it's all multiple choice, but those are the kinds of things to be thinking about as you work, come into the exam.
Yeah. And of course, hopefully you've been taking notes, diligent notes over the lectures and over the readings. If you haven't, then you really need to catch up on those in time for the final exam. And please do post on the discussion board. Even after, seeing this live session, we've been able to cover a lot of the topics that don't have as many comments on the discussion board, but it would be great to see exactly what your viewpoint is. That way that we can give feedback and give it any advice before the time of the exam.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Mary, for your help today with all this. You've been and all through the course. And thanks for anyone watching this. And good luck on the final exam.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Bye now.